Melissa.
Good morning and welcome to In the Garden. We are Montgomery County Master Gardeners with the University of Maryland Extension, and I'd like to introduce you to our experts today. I'm your moderator. My name is Melissa Siegel. We have Steve Dubik. He is the coordinator for the whole county of all the Master Gardeners and our teacher. And we have Sue Kuklevich, and she is with the Youth Garden Program, and she's going to talk to you about that in a few minutes. Steve, okay. Good morning.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Melissa. So as Melissa mentioned, I'm with the University of Maryland Extension. I'm the Master Gardener Coordinator for Montgomery County. We provide a number of services for the folks in Montgomery County, and I was just going to list a few of them. We have a speakers group that's very active in we're going out and giving talks, Zoom talks, and during this period, and they're still very active. We have our demo gardens. We're trying to get those kind of back into shape. We have a therapeutic horticultural program, trying to work with that. It's on a limited schedule right now. We have one-time events. We also have an Ask a Master Gardener program, 2 essentially plant clinics. We also have a youth gardening program, as Sue mentioned, as Melissa mentioned, and I'm just going to have Sue tell us a little bit about the youth gardening program.
Good morning. My name is Sue Kuklevich, and I am the coordinator of the youth garden program Growing Forward. I think with the massive food insecurity in our county, teaching people that you can grow your own food is so important. Also, given the concerns with climate change, it's equally important to teach kids stewardship of their environment. I spent 37 years as a teacher in the county, so I have a passion for working with kids. In 2015, we had the opportunity to start a new Master Gardeners program. Obvious to me that it should involve kids. So we started the Youth Garden Program at White Oak Community Center. Our mission is to provide students with an opportunity to develop organic gardening skills, an interest in healthy eating through a hands-on program, and an appreciation of the environment in their garden. It is our goal to not only teach gardening, but to tie this to the healthy eating habits. We use the state program Growing Healthy Habits that is also used in some of the schools as a guide. The program has been built almost entirely with donations of cash, tools, soil, and plants, as well as an urban youth garden grant from the Maryland Department of Agriculture, and support from the White Oak Recreation Center and Montgomery County Parks Community Garden Program. Yearly maintenance expenses are usually less than $300. The 1,000 square foot garden space is totally fenced to keep out critters. It consists of 6 raised beds and numerous large planters for a total of 240 square feet of gardening space. The children come from a community where schools have a farm rate of over 50%. This means that over 50% of the kids in the school are on free and reduced price meals. Each year our garden is open in March or April, depending on the weather. We begin working in the garden with children in the Recreation Center the after school care program for kids in grades K through 5 to plant spring vegetables and flowers. Children work together in small groups, planting, caring for, and harvesting plants weekly. Any food they harvest will go home with them. We teach kids about starting plants from seed and transplanting seedlings that we've been given. We work very hard to make sure the kids are the ones who plant most of the garden. We want to make sure that they take ownership. It took a few years to develop a gardening culture at White Oak, since this was very foreign to many in our community. We also participate in the White Oak Community Day in June to show off the garden to the public. At this event, we also host an activity to let kids plant a small plant to take home and care for. This is very popular. Once summer arrives, the summer camp program at the center opens for 6 weeks. We become a weekly 2-hour session for a group of 20 to 30 kids, usually in grades 2 through 4. We meet for a 2-hour session in which we divide the kids into 2 groups, and after an introductory session so everyone knows what the topic is for the day, one group goes outside to work in the garden. They weed, they plant, and harvest. They are also always looking for insects and other critters. They particularly like finding worms, but not so much spiders. We strive to teach them the difference between good bugs and bad bugs. The adults are also trying to incorporate the daily topic into the discussion in the garden or reinforcing previous topics. My particularly favorite topic is eating the rainbow. After a 25-minute session, they trade places, and the other group, who has just participated in a hopefully engaging activity to teach them gardening or nutrition lesson. We work hard not to make sure that the presentation is not like going to school on a regular basis. That we found turned kids off real fast. After the second garden session, we come back together to recap what we have found in the garden and learned in the classroom. They weigh their produce, and sometimes the kids shop for the part of the harvest that they would like to take home. The session is wrapped up with a nutritious snack, tying to the lesson, or maybe using something harvested in the garden. One year, Melissa made salsa with the tomatoes and the peppers and the onions and the garlic from our garden. So it was very much a snack from the garden that time. We've gotten very positive feedback from parents and kids. One little girl said, "I just love this garden. I wish I could sleep here." Of course, nothing beats the look on kids' faces when they dig up a potato or pick the first ripe tomato. It becomes their tomato or their potato, and they always want to take that particular piece of food home. Needless to say, the garden doesn't just stop when producing when camp ends in August, early August at that. Master gardeners continue to harvest and tend the garden until we can get after-school kids in September. Days are then shorter, so having a fall program is more difficult, but we try to engage the kids when possible. In the 5 years we've been open, we have harvested over 1,100 pounds of food, which is remarkable considering we only have 240 square feet of growing space to use each year. This has all been donated directly back to the families at the community center, except in the summer for the 2-week when they're closed, we donate it to a different community center nearby who also has kids that are food challenged. We have also added the flowers and veggies in the Montgomery County Fair, where numerous ribbons have been won by our kids. Sadly, this year, because of COVID virus, we were unable to have the kids in the garden. However, in early March and April, we were not sure we wouldn't have a summer program. So my team planted a garden anyway. We were so optimistic. We were actually gardeners. When we found out having kids was not going to happen, we couldn't just walk away from the garden. So we continued to work all summer and donated all the food harvested through Harvest Share to a local charity that helps alleviate food insecurity for many of our citizens. We have donated over 800 pounds that we have either grown or collected at our donation site, but I can't wait until next year when we can once again have children in the garden. I'm ever hopeful. By the way, Harvest Share is a Master Gardener activity that arose because we couldn't do another Master Gardener activity because of COVID. So we're resourceful. We believe this kind of program needs to exist in many community centers. If you have an interest in starting a garden program like ours, please contact us. If you can provide the structure, the volunteers to help maintain the garden, and the kids, we can help with the education part. Back to you, Melissa.
Well, I think Steve's next.
Yeah, thanks. So thanks very much, Sue. That's a wonderful program there, and they've worked really hard, and they've been very innovative and doing what they do on a very limited budget. And as you can see, they provide a lot of vegetables to the community and to the children that participate in the program. So if you have any questions regarding gardening questions or any questions regarding our programs, including the youth garden, please reach out to us. I think our website's posted, our link to us is posted on here today. The other thing is, if during the program, if you have gardening questions, please put them in the chat, and we'll try to answer those today. If we don't catch them today, we'll try to catch them in our next program. The other thing I wanted to mention that some folks have sent in some questions to us in the past, and we'll try to answer those today. And you can also look at previously answered questions in the garden on YouTube. So I think at this point, I'm bringing it back to our moderator.
Okay. Well, great. Since our last program, we received the following questions. Let's see. Our first question is about redbuds, and it's by Deanna Jensen. And she says that there are very many varieties of redbud that she likes, but she's particularly interested in the varieties that are variegated and one that has lime green and orange leaves. Can they be planted in the sun? Steve?
Okay, yes. As, she mentioned in the question that there are a lot of varieties of Redbud that have come out in the last several years. There's a very large demand for using native plants, and a Redbud is one of our native plants. There are a wide variety of cultivars, some that are variegated, and variegated just means that the foliage varies in its color from its normal, shade of green. So I was going to mention two or three that come to my mind. One that it has red foliage, but it's compact and it's dwarf, and it's called Ruby Falls. And Ruby Falls, one of its parents is forest pansy, which is a very popular redbud that has purple leaves throughout the growing season. But Ruby Falls has that color, but it has the habit of a weeping plant. So one of the things about Ruby Falls is that you can put this in a smaller, more compact area in a garden. So a lot of folks have just smaller landscapes and smaller yards. Redbud is not a terribly large tree, but nonetheless, that may take up more space than some people might have available. So that's one. Specifically, I mentioned things that have yellow and gold to it, and there is a cultivar called Hearts of Gold, and Hearts of Gold has more of a chartreuse color, but it's more of a full-size redbud, maybe not quite growing quite as fast. But that can add a lot of color to your landscape, which is, I think, maybe something what some people want, because particularly if you're using all native plants, and that's great, having maybe a native plant or two that varies in its color would just add something to it. Now, it is true that plants that have dark variegated or darker leaves, that a lot of the insects don't like to eat those as much. So caterpillars. So that's both a good thing and a bad thing. It's good. Well, your plant's not going to get chewed as much. The bad thing is it's not providing that ecological service to those caterpillars. But redbud isn't, let's say, a favorite a lot of caterpillars, but there are some that do eat it. So if you do have one that has red foliage, that's one thing you might be missing out. The last one I was going to mention is a cultivar called Rising Sun. Rising Sun is a more compact cultivar, and its newest leaves are kind of yellowish orange, and then they get more to a chartreuse green. It can be grown in full sun, but a lot of these cultivars that are variegated, particularly ones that are yellow in them, they're very prone to scorch. So if there's a period of time when there's not enough moisture, or maybe limited moisture and a lot of wind, you'll see the edges kind of get brown or crisped. It's not a pathogen, but it's sort of a physiological thing that happens when these plants can't get enough moisture up to the foliage quick enough, and so you get a little bit of scorch. Now they'll outgrow that, and that probably won't happen until later in the year. So things you can do to minimize that is to make sure that the plants are well watered when it's dry. Maybe put a mulch layer underneath to kind of keep it cool, conserve the moisture there. But they're and they do need good air circulation, particularly Rising Sun, which is a little more prone to some fungal diseases than I would say than the other redbuds. So that's my suggestion.
Great. Thank you so much, Steve. Our next question is going to be taken by Steve as well, and it's a plant ID question. It's submitted by Jan and Jeff, and they wanted to know what this plant is.
Well, that's a fairly unusual plant. The nice thing about what they did is they sent in a really nice picture, and we were able to, so if you do submit pictures, the higher resolution pictures really, really help out. So this is a type of plant. It's called Amorphophallus. And so in this genus called Amorphophallus, there's a number of different species and a whole bunch of hybrids. It's an interior foliage plant for the most part. Occasionally, some selections of this can be grown outdoors. It comes from almost like a tuber or a bulb-like structure that you can plant. And it does something very peculiar. It flowers first, then the leaves come out later. But when you first get this little bulb that you might buy, it may take 2, 3, or 4 years to get up to a plant that's sizable enough to have a flower. Now, I know you might like the flower, you might not like the flower. The flower is kind of a little peculiar looking. And some folks might know its big cousin, Amorphophallus titanium, which is the corpse flower, which you see down at the U.S. Botanic Gardens, and people come to see it. And it's 3, 4, 5 feet tall. It's huge, huge flower. But it's really smelly. It really doesn't smell great. It's there to attract flies, and the flies help to pollinate the plant. So the same thing is true if it's a little cousin we have here. I'm not sure exactly which one you have. It could be a hybrid. I'm not sure. You need to bring it in, but it may take a couple years before it gets sizable enough before it gets the flower. From the size it's in the picture, I think maybe in the next year or so you'll have that, and the flower comes up, and it comes out. It grows real quick, and then it does its thing. Then it dies. Then the leaves come out later. So it's a cool looking plant. May not be for everybody. Hopefully when it flowers, it's something you can take outside. I'm not sure if that's the kind of ambiance you want to have inside when you invite guests over, but it has a strong odor.
Well, thanks so much. We have a question now about peppers, and it was submitted by Kay Miles, and you'll see the picture there. Do you have any ideas on what has happened to my 2 peppers? Please help. Sue?
Yes, this seems to be an obvious example of anthracnose fungus or Colatrichium. Hot, rainy weather, which we've had a lot of that this year, and fields with a history of anthracnose mean higher risk of this disease in peppers and tomatoes. Anthracnose is caused by a species of the plant pathogen fungus Colatrichium. Causes no obvious leaf lesions on tomato foliage and only occasionally on peppers, but it really attacks the fruit. The fungus can be introduced on seeds and survive over the winter in temperate climates associated with crop debris. Fruits are infected when green peppers fruits develop large lesions with salmon-colored spores. When green or ripe, the tomato fruits do not develop the typical pumpkin lesions until they begin to ripen. Spores of the fungus are moved about by splashing rains or rainstorms, which we've had our share of this year, can promote disease spread throughout a field. Management practices include those thorough scouting, sanitation, removal of diseased fruits, and fungicide applications. There are some differences in susceptibility of peppers and tomato varieties to anthracnose, but none are highly resistant. Fungicides must be applied as soon as fruits begin to set and continue on a weekly schedule as fruits develop. This is probably not practical in the home garden. Scouting and sanitation are your best defense. Anthracnose is found in all major vegetable growing areas worldwide and can cause large losses if left untreated. You want to be real diligent about cleaning up your garden and paying attention to what's happening there. Always plant disease-free seeds and transplant seeds can be free from infection by treating with hot water up to 125 degrees for 30 minutes. The disease is known to be present. The field should be rotated with non-susceptible crops for a period of 3 years. Plowing crop residue deeply into the soil, removing crop debris can help to reduce the inoculum in the soil, but the best idea in your home garden is to remove all of the plant debris, the fruit, the plants, everything, and do not put them in your home compost, because you're just going to continue the problem. So not unusual, but unfortunate.
Thank you so much, Sue. Our next question is submitted by Kay, and she says, hi, is it okay to use worm casting tea indoors in potted plants? If so, will it start to smell? Is it okay to use worm castings in indoor potted plants? So I'm going to take this because I raise worms in my kitchen. And it's a great question, Kay. Thank you. The best and safest way to use worm castings for indoor plants is to add them to the soil as castings. They release nutrients slowly as you water and are naturally organic, and I think the best way to fertilize houseplants. If you use worm cast tea, which you have brewed properly, that's also beneficial, but in many cases, when you water too much, the nutrients leach out. I suggest using both methods at the same time, but my favorite is just using water with the castings embedded in the soil. This is not the liquid at the bottom of the container. That's called worm cast leach. And it's got lots of organic matter that may be decomposed. If you use that, you will have smell in your house, in your plants that you put it in. You can make tea out of it. I think you can even boil it, but you're gonna ruin the nutrients. So I just stay away from that and get rid of it in the yard outside because I don't want the smell to be in my home. And let's see. That's it. My next question is transplanting perennials. Who's going to talk about that? Linda Weiss sent her in her question, and the first question is, I have black-eyed Susans and Jacob's Ladder growing nicely in containers on my deck. Can I transplant them into my garden? If you think I can do this successfully, can you tell me when? Now? And how do I cut them back or plant as is? If it's not a good idea, how can I keep these perennials alive over the winter so they'll come back next year? As always, thank you for your help and advice.
Okay, this is a really good question for this time of the year. This is the time of the year to talk about perennials. The weather is cooler, so it's a more pleasant time to do some heavy-duty gardening chores. And I love my annuals, but perennials come back year after year. So if you don't get to them in the spring, you still have some flowers to see. Choosing natives also provides food for our native insects, and dead plants provide winter cover for food for many insects and birds. So perennials are very useful to have. They're the plants that grow back year after year. Dividing and splitting them into multiple plants helps the plant perform better, so it's also a good time of the year to have perennials, and they absorb more nutrients, and you probably have a better show the following year. Dividing perennials can help manage the size of the plant, and it also can get rid of some dead spots in the middle of some of the plants. It's not too late. Fall, we still have a good 6 to 8 weeks, well, maybe not quite that much now. A beautiful fall garden ahead of us. You can transplant perennials anytime into the ground until the ground freezes in the fall, or wait until you transplant them in the spring. Fall is the excellent time to transplant herbaceous perennials because your plants will then have 3 seasons to establish a root system before hot summer weather sets in. Herbaceous perennials are the non-woody plants whose tops die down in the winter. They come back year after year from the root system. A good rule of thumb is to transplant your summer and spring blooming perennials in the fall, and then your spring blooming ones after they bloom in the spring. For transplanting out of a container or dividing perennials, be sure to improve the soil where you intend to plant to promote vigorous root growth. Also choose a spot that's has appropriate growing conditions. So your Jacob's Ladder is a woodland perennial, so it's going to want a more shaded area to be planted. But your black-eyed Susans prefer the sun, so make sure you pick a good spot for them as well. Jacob's Ladder can suffer root scorch if you put it with too much sun or heat. Deadheading and dropping seeds from the seeds in the same area from your black-eyed Susans is always a good idea to give you more plants if you want them. Cutting back is not necessary. Once they are planted in the ground, we encourage you to leave the dead growths to provide winter habitat for many insects. It also helps you remember where you planted in the spring so that you don't mistakenly dig it up or plant another plant on top of it, which I'm notorious for doing. Early October is a good time to prune back herbaceous plants that will be killed to the ground with the first frost, if you want to, like hostas, daylilies, bee balms, which are monarda, astilbes, and peonies. Any diseased foliage should not be put in your household compost. You need to get rid of it. And this is particularly true, I think, with peonies or anything else that maybe has had some other diseases throughout the season. Now is a good time to be dividing perennials that have exceeded their space, have formed tight clumps with diminished blooms, or have developed dead space in the center of the plant. Although leaves may become damaged or plants may appear misshapen, in the spring. In our hosta, if you're lucky enough to be where a place you don't have deer, because the deer just destroy mine. Rudbeckia, irises, Japanese and Siberian irises are really in need of dividing often. Extra mulching is not necessary, provided you have selected plants that are hardy in your area. In fact, just as matted leaves may contribute to winter root rot, excessive mulch can have the same effect on hardy perennials. Exceptions to my no mulch recommendation would be for newly planted or divided plants and plants that are only marginally winter hardy in your area. It would cover these plants with several inches of mulch for the winter, probably in late October, early November, but remove it in the spring. If rain is sufficient, you should continue watering. Is insufficient, you should continue watering perennials, shrubs, and trees until a hard freeze occurs, especially newly planted or divided materials. Plants should not go into winter with insufficient water around the roots. Do not fertilize perennials in the fall, even when newly planting or dividing them. This will encourage herbaceous leaf and flower growth rather than the more desirable root formation. So, perfect time to go out there and transplant. Just go to it.
Thank you so much. It's really helpful, especially for the time right now in our gardens. Okay, the next question is about boxwood disease, boxwoods. I am new to boxwood. I recently ordered some, and a few of them arrived with spots on them, but I have no clue if it's boxwood blight or something else, and I don't want to accidentally plant an infected boxwood in my yard. There's attached pictures, and Steve, would you like to take that one?
Yeah, thanks, Melissa. Sure. Excuse me. So yeah, looking at the pictures, it's not quite clear what the situation may be, but I have a hunch. Good news, I don't think it's boxwood blight. I don't see lesions right on the stems, and the spots that are on the leaves are not quite consistent with boxwood blight. So that's good. The other thing is volutella canker, which is still the major disease that attacks boxwoods, usually established boxwoods. But I think what you may have is you might have boxwood leaf miner. So what they do is, it's an insect that has one generation of year. As the name sounds, it mines inside the leaf. So initially, when the eggs are laid earlier in the year, in the growing season, they develop, and you don't really notice much. But later on in the growing season and the beginning of next year, when they overwinter inside the leaf, you start to see the leaf pucker, maybe discolor a little bit. One way to tell, and I think you can even see them at this time of the year, is if you take the leaf and you twist it open, the top and bottom of the leaf will kind of open up almost like a pita pocket. And inside there will be a small little insect. It's going to be small, but you'll see it. It'll be wiggling around. Then you know for sure you have leaf miner. Now, you've got leaf miner. What can you do? Well, there's a few options you can do. You can apply chemicals, but in order to get the job done, the chemical has to get into where the insect is. So that relies on using a systemic. A number of the systemic insecticides have been withdrawn from use for homeowners. There's still a few others. You could do that. You could go that option. The other is just to wait it out. Yes, it's going to get a little bit worse next year, but maybe even another growing season. But often what I observe, this is anecdotal, is that you go through a cycle of several years, and then the population of the leaf miner, it crashes, or it goes down to a base level, and it might cycle up and down, and you live with it. You could try to manage the adults, but that's kind of tricky. They come out, and it's interesting. You'll see them in the spring. When they emerge, they're really small little gnats, and they're usually just a few feet away, and they're kind of in a little ball flying around all together there, and you see them sometimes. Sometimes people will treat those with an insecticide, almost any kind of insect, soaps or oils or neem. If you can hit them, that might suppress it. But another option is, in the future, if it is a real big problem where you are, just to let you know, there are certain cultivars that are very resistant to this significant pest, this boxwood leaf miner too. There's some newer cultivars. You can go to your garden center. They can tell you about that, and some of the other cultivars that are also resistant that have just been released to boxwood blight. It's called this New Gen series, and there's a couple of cultivars that are out there. So that's a little more optimism if you're into boxwoods, because this disease, boxwood blight, which is around, it's a tough disease to manage. It's a very tough disease to manage, and so I would look maybe in the future to look for cultivars, but I think what it is, it's a leaf miner in there. So in some ways, I hope it is. I hope it's not boxwood blight. But anyway, good luck.
Thanks, Steve. The next question has been submitted by Alexis, and she has two pictures and asks, what is causing these webs in my Pachysandra bed? Are they damaging the plants? Well, actually, they aren't damaging the plants, and I have a hillside near my house that's covered with native Pachysandra. And right now, at this time, in fact, today, we saw some of these webs spun by these spiders called funnel spiders. And if you got up this morning and went outside and saw it was foggy, there was moisture in the air, it's a great time to see where all the spider webs are in your plants and around your house. As I said, they're not detrimental. They do eat predators and insects, spiders, and other arthropods that wander too close. The eggs are laid in late summer, so they probably already laid their eggs. And they lay them under a rock, on a piece of old wood, or rolled up in a leaf. A single egg sac can contain 50 to 200 eggs. The females are good parents and guard their egg sacs until the onset of winter, when they die. And in the spring, hundreds of spiderlings emerge from the egg sacs. So they're not, I wouldn't do anything. I think they're just fine to have, and they sure look pretty, I think. Next question is about tomatoes, tomato ripening, and this is for Sue. It's also submitted by Alexis. And she says, I brought at the end of the season tomatoes inside to ripen on the kitchen counter, but many of them are ripening unevenly. As much as half the tomato remains green and long after the half has turned red. How do I get them to ripen completely? Sue?
Okay, well, uneven ripening of tomatoes is often due to environmental stress. Plant genetics is also another cause for more of the following factors. Environmental stress, we certainly have had that this year. Lots of rain and then lots of dry spots and terribly high temperatures, and then now a very cool fall. So it's not surprising some of this is going on. The growing season being too short might affect the crop too, might be affecting how easily they're ripening. As you said, you're having to bring them into the kitchen counter to finish ripening. Some of us weren't very good about getting our tomato plants out very early last spring, and we did have late frost, so that affected how early we got things done. That might be part of your problem. So they may just have been planted too late. Excessive shade, high spacing prevents plants from successfully ripening their fruit. Cool temperatures in late summer, which I think we've definitely had, and early fall combined with diminishing daylight prevent fruits from ripening fully. This is often observed in tomatoes and peppers. Cool weather will also cause blotchiness and odd-colored patterns on fruit. Some cultivars may be more susceptible to uneven ripening, often called green shoulder or large discolored areas. One of the Missouri Botanical Garden also suggests that fairy to ripen could be dependent on temperatures below 6 or above 80. In fact, the soils are really wet soils into the root system development, which affects ripening. And low potassium is also one possibility, although I'm not quite sure exactly how that works, but having a soil test done might help with that, figuring out why your tomatoes are not ripening. But in my experience, this has not been a wonderful year for tomatoes, although I have heard a lot of people had great crops. I've had horrible crops, and the darn squirrels just keep stealing what I do get. So it's not been a really good year for tomatoes. But your tomatoes actually look pretty good, and maybe they will finish ripening.
Thank you so much, Sue. Next question is about spring blooming bulbs. When should I plant my spring bulbs? Planting times are different for different kinds of bulbs. Hardy spring flowering bulbs are planted in the late summer and the early fall, and hardy fall flowering bulbs are planted in August. Tender summer flowering bulbs are planted in the spring after the danger of frost. Lilies are best planted in the late fall. So it's really important, first of all, to select high quality spring bulbs because the flower bulb has already developed before the bulb is sold to us. Size is important, and you should look for plump, firm bulbs. Also check the root base to make sure that the area is firm and intact. The most reliable bulbs for tulips are the Darwin hybrids and species tulips such as linifolia and tarda. These tulips tend to live much longer, come back year after year, and truly perennialize in the garden rather than many of the other cultivars that live for just a few years or even just one and then die off. My favorite bulb is the crocus. It's a tough, durable crocus that is one of the best species to live in lawns or compacted areas. They naturalize really well. They're really pretty, and then you just mow them down when you start mowing your lawn once they've already flowered. Most bulbs need full sunshine, so select a planting site that will provide at least 5 to 6 hours of sunlight a day. And bulbs left in the ground for years, year after year, should have 8 to 10 hours of daily sunlight for good flowering. And adequate drainage is really important. You don't want to plant your bulbs in an area that's moist all of the time and not water too much. If it's overwatered or planted in a wet area, it will mold and deteriorate. For individual planting holes, you should loosen the soil below the depth the bulb is to be planted, add some fertilizer and cover that with a layer of soil so the fertilizer does not touch the bulbs. Set the bulb upright in the planting hole and cover with amended soil, and you can, if you mulch, put some mulch, but I wouldn't put too much on over where you've planted the bulbs. And we're going to talk now about a native ground cover. Steve has some good information. This question is, I have a very steep fenced-in hillside on the southwest side of my house. I removed the turf grass and would like to put it in some type of native ground cover in the center so I can walk over it, but still leave the 2 feet on each side for other plants and herbs. Suggestions from Adrian Higgins' recent column are epimedium, leadwort, hellebores, cranesbill, mazes, creeping jenny, and begonia. I may need to hire someone to do some grading and planting. There's a lot of rainwater that pours down during the heavy rainstorms. What do you think, Steve?
Okay, yeah, this is where a case where the picture is very, very, very helpful. It is sunny, but there's, as in the picture, you can see there's houses and there's a fence around there. So it's a little bit protected there. So one of the things about the suggestion is trying to find a native ground cover that you can walk on. And it's not really, I mean, we do have turf grasses. One turf grass that is native is fine fescue. So that could be a choice, but that likes shade and it kind of likes dry shade a little bit. So one thought I had is that you would have stepping stones going up through that path, and around that path you could put some of these other ground covers that Adrian suggested. I'm not sure how many were actually native, but you could put in some native grasses or sedges. They're not technically not grasses, like our native Pennsylvania sedge or blue wood sedge. And they can kind of tumble over on the stones a little bit, and that might be an option. Now they handle shade a little bit more, but if it's a little bit more sunny, then you can use. We do have a native sedum. Most sedums that you come across, they're one sedum a lot of people remember is autumn joy. That's kind of tall, but there's lots and lots of dwarf sedums, and that's what they use on green roofs. Now, most of those sedums are not native, but we do have 1 or 2 native sedums. You can probably check those out at the garden center. And they could tumble around or be edged right around the stone. You really don't walk on them, but if you walk on a little, the plant will repair itself. You can also swap that out if it's a very sunny, dry location that you can grow with thyme, creeping thyme. Now, that's not native, but one of the nice things about that, it handles, sunny or drier areas. And if you do step on the thyme, you get the fragrance from the thyme. And there's many different kinds of thyme that have different fragrances. There's some that have many that have lemon, more of a citrus, more of course a thyme. But there's other unusual ones like chocolate and coconut and caraway and things like that. So those could be some options. But there are a number of other types of carex besides Carex pennsylvanicum and our blue wood sedge. There's one that's called bunny blue, but it's kind of wider blade, needs little bit shade. Might work in that area off to the sides, but that's probably what I would try, is use stepping stones and a combination with other lower growing native ground covers, and we have a few. So that's my thoughts. Thanks.
Thank you, Steve. Do we have any questions that have been sent in by the chat?
Yes, we do. One of our viewers was wondering that she had moved a butterfly bush and it doesn't look good. Do you have any suggestions?
Okay. Well, I might kind of follow up with that. Generally, Budley is a very, very tough plant, and they need a sunny location. So if it's been recently transplanted and it was during the summer and it had that foliage on it, it may be a fair amount of transplant shock. But at this, I'm optimistic it's going to come back. What you may want to do, depending on I don't know how recently it's been transplanted, if you see a lot of wilt on the edge and it's recently done, you may want to cut that back. It might encourage it to sprout a little here. Hopefully not, because the days are getting shorter, and it'll try to get the timing and the end of the growing seasons here. But knowing Budley, I think it's a pretty good top plant. I think it's going to regroup. I think you'll see the improvement really next year. My guess is probably just going to struggle out for the remaining of this season. One thing we do need to be concerned is that it has been fairly wet, and we do need to make sure that it has a site that has good drainage, and it is a sunny location. Other than that, the other thing you will do anyway, and we're getting close to the end of the year, is that generally people prune their Budley back very hard, generally after the coldest part of winter's gone. So pruning it back now, I wouldn't worry about it too much if you need to do that to reinvigorate the plant, just to keep it from losing moisture, because you're going to prune it back again anyway in the late winter. So hopefully it will recover. That's just my thoughts.
Great.
Do you have any suggestions on what to plant in a winter garden? For a winter garden, what should you be planting now?
There's a few things. Real popular group of plants are hellebores. And there's many kinds of this unbelievable amount of selection of them. And every year there seems to be more and more. They seem to be relatively easy to breed. And some of these hellebores will flower even in late November. Some flower in December, some will flower in the winter. And in the past, they're more of a purple flower and they kind of nodded down. Now they're much more upright. Flowers are larger. There's whites. They're real colorful whites with maybe purple or a pink speckling or solid white. And so that would be a really good plant for a winter garden.
I have a yellow one.
Oh, there you go. Wow.
Wow.
So yeah, and I know Melissa and others, we've seen a lot of these over the years. They're very popular, and they have evergreen foliage too. And the wonderful things about hellebores is they're extremely shade tolerant. So during the winter, they could be under a tree, a large native shade tree or shade tree you have out there. They're getting enough light. The tree canopy gets developed next year. And they'll hang out there in that low amount of shade, and they're relatively deer resistant. It's true that they're not native. Some do self-sow more than others, and my guess is that the hybrids probably will self-sow very infrequently. I think the species will do a little bit more, but that varies. I don't know. Everybody says, well, mine doesn't, some don't. But just check around with your gardening friends, maybe the garden center, and some of the newer cultivars are relatively expensive. And so there's a whole bunch of options there. That's for kind of a perennial. For shrubs, you've got a number of plants that flower in the middle of winter. I'll go into like the witch hazel, Hamamillus. We have our native one that flowers here in the fall. We have Hamamillus vernalis, which is native to the Midwest, and that usually flowers around between Christmas and the beginning of January, when we get a relatively warm day. It's a small tree, large shrub, depending upon how it's pruned. Then we have some other witch hazels will flower later on. That could be a good option, and that has fragrance too. That could be a good option.
What about
So those are two.
Japonica?
I'm sorry.
Pyrrhus?
Pyrrhus japonica. So Pierce japonica, that will flower in maybe early November. I'm sorry, excuse me, early March. Sometimes as early as March we get one pip, but generally that's a little bit later on. There's Chiamanthus precox, which is a winter sweet, which is a little harder to find, and that usually flowers sometime in February, March. There's a beautiful specimen down around the National Arboretum, right around the administration building. It's been there for years. That's a little harder to find, but that flowers in the winter. Of course, we have another witch hazel, the intermediate witch hazel, which will flower probably the end of January, February. And there's lots of cultivars of that. The Primavera, Arnold Promise, and they have fragrance in wide range of colors. So those are two. And then there's Daphne, the winter Daphne, Daphne odora. Of course, some of these plants that I'm mentioning here maybe a little harder to find, a little bit more expensive, particularly Daphne odora. But if you get a Daphne odora established, it's evergreen foliage. There are cultivars that are variegated too. They have wonderful fragrance. There's several cultivars available, but they need moist, well-drained soils. They're prone to root rot. Once they get established, and hopefully you've got a good site, they'll be a long-lived plant, but it might be a little tricky to get it going. They may need some help during our summers, not this summer particularly from rain, but sometimes it gets hot and dry, and you're going to be mindful for them. So even if they've been established, you might have to water them a bit during the summer. But that would be a really good fragrant plant, and it doesn't get very big, maybe 3 feet by 5 feet. And that'll be a big one. Most people, that's going to be a little bit smaller. With what they can afford, it's probably like 12 inches by 12 inches, and it's going to take a few years. It's not very fast growing. You could put this right next to your house, your entrance, and you can smell the wonderful flowers. And it does flower in the middle of winter. So those are a few. I probably, there's some others, but that's what just comes to my mind.
Okay, thank you. That's all the questions.
Okay.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Our next In the Garden program will be October the 20th. That's 2 weeks from today, same time, and it is our last program of the season. So we hope that you'll join us. Remember, if you have any questions, please contact us at the link on the screen. Thanks so much. Have a great day.